presentation of Marcus. He's very welcome on stage. Yes.
So did we agree on need the microphone or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
For the video, yeah. Sorry.
That's right. No problem. Right, so my name is Marcus, as you can see. I apologize for the change in the haircut. I already had some disappointed comments this morning. I am a conservation photojournalist and a travel writer. Thank you. And I'm thirsty.
It's also very warm in that corner.
Yeah, I was just saying.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I'm heading north after this, so enjoy the sun while I can. So, I spend most of my time working around the world covering conservation questions, conservation issues rather. And so that is largely what we're going to be talking about today. Now, obviously, wilderness is a concept that we could spend hours talking about from a philosophical standpoint if we wanted to. We could talk about the world's amazing wild places, but we're not going to do that because we only have a short while. I know I have 20 minutes and then time for Q&A. It may be that I talk for less than that because I prefer Q&As to actual presentations, but we'll see how we go. So, as I said, my job is to document conservation issues as well as some of the stories that provide us with a few glimmers of hope, which I think we need those as well. And today's talk is going to be a mixture of those two things. Right, some good news, some less good news, but hopefully the less good news are still things that may encourage some of you to get involved in some of these questions. So just to begin where we stand today. Now, as I said, wilderness is a concept that we could talk about for a long time, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But from an environmental perspective, it makes more sense to talk about ecosystems, and specifically like functionally intact ecosystems, which basically means ecosystems that work the way they're supposed to work. Most people probably have some idea that there aren't as many of those left as we would wish, but most people also don't realize just how terrible the situation really is, right? Because the truth is that less than 3% of our land area consists what would be classified as a functionally intact ecosystem, which is terrible. Like the EU's goal, for example, at the moment is that we should have 30%. And that isn't just 30% overall, it's 30% of every type of ecosystem should be essentially functionally intact, and we're nowhere near that. And even within those 3%, there isn't really anywhere that isn't affected by humans one way or another. I mean, whether it's climate change or air pollution or something more direct, such as the things you can see in these photos, right? Now the good news is that these 3% or 2.9% could be increased almost tenfold through proper management. Right? Now, for most of us, the idea of managed wilderness areas isn't exactly where we want to be, right? We like the idea of wilderness as something that that can be in peace, right? You let nature have its course and let nature do its thing. But unfortunately, that's not really where we're at the moment. As I said, the amount of human encroachment in most of the world is to such an extent that fences, though we may not like the idea of them, are necessary to protect what's left of the wilderness, right? It might be to protect the wildlife from whatever is on the outside. It might be to reduce conflict between communities and people. It's also becoming increasingly necessary in much of the world to move animals around. Now again, this is something that in the past would have happened quite naturally. Lions in Africa, for example, would have been able to migrate on their own. Populations that way stay healthy and genetically diverse. But with fewer and fewer wilderness areas left, that's just not possible anymore. So unless we want inbreeding, we have to shift them around. And that is not necessarily only a bad news story. It's not good that we need to do it. But the truth is that some of the places that have had their wildlife disappear now have it back again. So Rwanda, for example, today has rhinos and lions, which 10 years ago it didn't. Rhinos have been reintroduced to a number of Central African countries where they've been missing for decades. And yes, humans are the reason for why they're missing in the first place. But that is essentially that is every single conservation issue and conservation solution. Very little of it is about trying to right something that has gone wrong in a natural way. It's usually about offsetting mistakes that we have caused in the first place, which doesn't make them any less important. Rhino dehornings, so this is not a dead rhino, this is a sedated rhino. This is another instance where human intervention, even if it is against other humans, has become increasingly necessary. Rhino poaching is absolutely out of control, and one way of trying to reduce it is to sedate rhinos and cut off their horns, which is depressing, but it is necessary. So hands off from a conservation point of view at the moment isn't always going to be the best solution. So at some point, hopefully, in more and more areas, we can be more hands-off, but at the moment, unfortunately, we can't be. But rewilding does provide real hope for the future. So this is a pangolin. For those of you who can't see, it's been fit with a tractor. Pangolins are actually the most trafficked animal in the world, which is not something that most people are aware of, but they are eaten, and the scales are used for so-called medicine. So what about Sweden? So how many did we have any Swedes here? Yeah, we had a few, right? Yeah. Now Sweden, we don't have a huge human population. We don't fence our national parks. It's not really necessary. We don't have animal translocations. It's not deemed necessary at all. And we're frequently told that Sweden is covered by forest, right? 70% of the country is covered by forest, and that we're a very green country in all interpretations of the world. So we're fine, right? Well, the truth is that we're not. I used to think so, but the reason I'm in Sweden is actually to work on some of these questions. It's also why we moved this to a Monday, because today I have to drive about 15 hours north to continue this documentation. So when we are told that 70% of Sweden is covered by forest, it's usually accompanied by a photo like this, which is a nice forest. But unfortunately, those 70% also include this. This fits the official definition of what a forest is in Sweden. This is a forest. This is a forest. See, they don't, and when I say they, I should specify we're talking about both the forestry industry, but also the government in Sweden, even the official, the forestry agency in Sweden. When they say forest, they don't mean natural forests, they don't mean old growth forests, they don't mean intact ecosystems, they don't mean wilderness, they mean there are trees, or there were trees, and there will be trees again soon, because we're planting them. But trees don't necessarily make a forest, and to me, calling anything that has trees or might have trees a forest is a little bit like calling a zoo a savanna, because there are lions there, right? A savanna wouldn't be complete without the lions, but the presence of lions doesn't guarantee that you have a forest. And the unfortunate truth is that we are losing our last productive old growth forests very, very fast. We are clear-cutting them faster than Brazil is clear-cutting the Amazon. Much faster, even though it's obviously a smaller area to begin with. Pictures like these are not rare if you travel to the north. It's not actually rare in the south either, but it tends to be further away from the main roads, so it's harder to see. But the farther north you travel in the country, the fewer people there are, the more blatant it becomes. And it affects everybody. So the rights of the indigenous Sami in Sweden are being ignored with a lot of this. They depend on the old growth forest for their reindeer herding. But that's not the end of it. I mean, the surveys have shown that somewhere around 90 to 95% of Swedes don't want clear cuts. I don't know what the other 5 to 10% were thinking when they answered that they were fine with it, but that's clearly, I don't think they want it where they live. But that's being completely ignored. The data coming in and the advice of independent scientists from around the world is also being ignored in favor of industry-affiliated scientists in Sweden. And the reason I asked if you guys, how many of you are Swedish or understand Swedish, is if you read the Swedish news, you might actually have heard about this in the last couple of years, because it's been publicized quite a lot, but not very much outside of Sweden. But the scandals that have broken here about the heads of the largest research projects, like long-term research projects into the sustainability of forestry in Sweden, were headed by people who were simultaneously or immediately afterwards given board positions for some of the largest forestry companies in the country. And that's been absolutely fine, apparently, until recently. And other scientists have come out saying that they've been bullied by the industry to produce results that favor clear cutting. So we are talking about greenwashing on a national scale here, but this isn't just a problem for Sweden. Not only because it's not only happening in Sweden. Our neighbors to the east, Finland, are just as bad. Baltic states not doing so great. Canada has a few issues. Russia, let's not go there. But more than that, Sweden is currently blocking the EU from introducing stricter measures about forestry in the Amazon, because anything that applies there coming from the EU has to apply to the EU member states as well. So basically what the EU wants to do is to look at a number of industries that cause environmental issues and place minimum sustainability measures for products before they're allowed on the EU market. Now Sweden doesn't want that, because we'd have to stop doing this if we have such measures for wood, right? And so the Amazon is burning in large part because measures that have been trying to be introduced from the EU for several years have been blocked by us. So go Sweden. Now, if this bothers you, and I hope it does, it bothers me. It was a shock to me when I learned about this. I work with questions like these, but I never worked in Sweden because Sweden was fine. And so I would spend my time in other parts of the world covering problems there and trying to find people who are looking for solutions. Once I learned what was happening here, I decided to redirect my attention a bit. And I am sorry, I know this is a depressing subject, but it is important, because in other parts of the world, I tend to focus on the solutions because we need those glimmers of hope. But here, the greenwashing campaigns are so massive that everyone thinks that we're fine, everything's good in Sweden, we don't need to worry about what's happening here. And I do think we need to. So it is a Monday morning, you're not meant to be happy, it's fine. If you do want to get involved in any way, obviously other than just reducing our own consumption and being a bit more skeptical, there are a whole bunch of great organizations in the country. Most of them have local chapters. Naturarvet, for example, is an organization that buys up old growth forest and protects it, which you can do. You can protect your forest. There's a lot of pressure on forest owners as well to clear cut from the larger companies who basically want large volumes of wood to make paper and biofuel. But all these other ones as well, there's a lot happening. And as I said, I'm driving north today to document a few of these things. Together with another photographer, we started Deforestation in Sweden a while back, and the aim was basically to provide images to counter the campaigns that you see from the forestry companies. You won't have missed those ones because they were on all the bus stations like last year. It was called the Swedish Forest, like that first picture I showed you. But you know, we thought we would try to balance the equation a little bit at least. It's just been fun, and you know, we've had some success, but it's a massive uphill battle. And even with journalists now in Sweden really turning to this, we still need a bit of international attention as well. And I just want to finish with a little bit of a plug. So I'm working on a book project at the moment with. Now, if you're into photography, you will recognize a whole bunch of the names on the left. If not, then you won't. But you know, 2/3 of them are pretty well-known National Geographic photographers. And this is a book that basically covers issues like this from around the world. But as you can see from the cover, also some of the solutions and some of the people working on the front lines. And there's a Kickstarter for this. So if you want to have an important book with some great photos, then please go to the Kickstarter and buy it. Yeah, if this had been a longer presentation, then I would have now had 100 beautiful photos from around the world to make you feel better. But I'm not going to do that. So I'll take questions. I really don't mind on what subject it can be on this or anything else. It's just more fun to answer questions than to stand here and talk.
I have do you want to do that? Oh, you can do it if you want. Yeah, I just have a broad question, but how did you get involved in this, right? Is this something that
You mean the forestry or in everything?
Career. What you're doing today, basically.
Yeah, very randomly. I used to be a personal trainer a long time ago, and then I decided I wanted to do a degree in environmental science. So I went to Tasmania, which is about as far as you can get from here. Not on purpose, but it was a nice place to study. And I was there for 3 years. I hadn't really picked up a camera at that point. I started to, and I started doing some bushwalking. And then I organized to do my honors research year in Kenya. So I lived in the Masai Mara for a year. And when I moved there, I decided that it was probably a good idea to buy a few extra lenses and see if I could make a go of that. And by the end of the year, it seemed like that was going to be a more useful career to tell the stories of important work being done by a lot of people rather than to spend all my time working on a single topic.
So you're a self-taught photographer?
I'm completely self-taught, yeah.
I have a few questions. The picture that we saw earlier with the rhino being dehorned. Firstly, I assume that all of these pictures, these are the ones that you've taken yourself.
Oh yeah.
They're really beautiful. Are we doing this because we're taking away the major asset that people want to poach them for?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, especially in this part of the world where we're a bit removed from these questions, the impressions we often get of these fights are don't really tell the whole story. So wildlife is, I think, the third or fourth largest illegal industry in the world after arms and drugs. So I think it's larger than human trafficking, right? And there are different kinds of poaching, but ivory and rhino in particular, I mean, we are talking about organized crime on exactly the same level as we do with drugs and arms. Highly sophisticated, ridiculously wealthy, very well organized. It is an incredibly expensive fight. So having rhinos in Southern Africa, where a lot of them are privately owned, so they're in private reserves, is not really profitable even if you have high-end tourism. So it really is, at this point, like a conservation undertaking to have rhinos at all, because the security is so expensive. So this is not, unfortunately, this is not enough. So this was taken in private reserve outside Kruger in South Africa. And they still have to have incredibly sophisticated anti-poaching measures and fences and security systems, because there's still enough here for several tens of thousands of dollars. And the horns grow back, so they have to do this every year or every 2 years on all the rhinos. But without that, of course, the value of the horns on one rhino might be 20 times what it is now.
So what happens to them then? Because the artifact is still there, right? And it's still worth a lot of money.
Yeah, they get locked away or burned, but usually locked away. So I mean, when you do something like this, it's a large operation. So you'll have a spotter plane and a helicopter. You dart them from the helicopter, and then you've got several cars coming in. You have maybe 40-45 minutes to do this. Veterinarians, researchers, rangers, and there will also be somebody from the government who is there specifically to take care of the horns, so that as soon as they are taken off, they're weighed and they're identified, and I think often they're chipped, and then they are taken into their custody straight away. Because the last thing you want to do is have any suspicions that you are doing something else with the horns. It's not good.
But do they get like psychological care? I mean, like imagine waking up and being like, oh my goodness, part of my body is missing.
Yeah, it's hard to give them psychological care.
Yeah, but I mean, like, of course.
But it doesn't, as far as we know, it doesn't affect their behavior that much.
Okay.
And probably, I would guess, especially so, because usually an area will either dehorn all of its rhinos or none. And so it's not like you'll have two without horns and then the rest of them with horns. So in a place like this, they try to dehorn all of them. It's hard. In the beginning, it's easy, because if you've got 200 rhinos, you're going to find some every day to dehorn. But then, like finding the last 5, and especially black rhinos like this one, they are browsers, so they like bush, and they're shy, and they are solitary. White rhinos, you tend to find them in groups and out in the open and on the grassland, and they're less aggressive, so they're easier to deal with. But yeah, some of these, when you go around, I mean, the first day we spent doing this, we dehorned 6 rhinos. The second day we found 1 all day, and we were working from sunrise to sunset. So.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
I was wondering how you get involved in these projects. Do you work as a freelance photojournalist, or are you affiliated with like a press agency, or how do you do?
No, I'm freelance, and it's pretty much just grown organically over the years. So when I did my research in Kenya, I reached out to a few NGOs in the area, research projects, and said, hey, I'm here, I can help with data, but I can also help with photography. And it turned out that what they needed help with the most was photography. And it is a pretty small world. So if you spent a few years working with, at the beginning it was all pro bono, basically, and all the NGOs were small and didn't have any budgets. But then over the years, you build up a portfolio, but you also build up a reputation. And I mean, the most important thing is just to be nice and to be easy to work with. There are lots of good photographers, and many of them are nice, but if you don't have the field experience, and they don't know that you have the field experience, and that you know how to behave around situations like this, then it's harder, and so it becomes easier with time. And it's the same with publications. In the beginning it was more logging and working for some Scandinavian magazines, but then once you get your first story with New York Times, and you get your second one, and then all of a sudden you're a New York Times photographer, and that makes a big difference. You have to introduce yourself less and less when you contact a publication, or more and more they contact you. And then I'm part of a few like conservation photography societies and things, and that helps as well. But no, always freelance.
But do you kind of just say, hey, I have my own kind of side gig, if you need any help, I can help. By the way, my hourly rate is X.
No,
like,
so
how does that work?
No, in the beginning, a little bit, but I mean now it's been many years that this is a full-time job, and so I only go somewhere if I have an assignment to do there. Now it could be that I have one assignment, and then because I'm in the area, I'll contact a few smaller organizations that I know would find it difficult to pay for a photographer, and if I think that what they're doing is important or interesting, or there might be a story there, then I'll see if I can give them a hand. But it's also the reason why I do travel writing, because travel writing helps pay for the bills. So I write and photograph like a lot for Vagabond, for example, which is Scandinavia's biggest travel magazine. And that's great because that'll get me to somewhere, and I choose my own assignments, and so I pitch them to them. So if I have a job in South Africa, then I'll make sure to pitch a couple of stories, and then once I'm there and my flights are paid for anyway, then I'll see if I find a few smaller organizations who wouldn't be able to pay for a photographer under normal circumstances, and then see if we find a way that we can work it out.
You just mentioned like the travel writing. Is it like connected to the conservation, or is like a different?
Yeah, it's not unconnected. So I'm mainly covered like nature, tourism, or like the last assignment I had was in Uzbekistan, and I mean that's quite like a depressing environmental story with Aral Sea, or the former Aral Sea. So it's a tourism or travel story, but there are environmental aspects to it. A lot of my work is in Africa, and tourism is absolutely instrumental for conservation in Africa. If it wasn't for wildlife tourism, they would be in a similar situation to much of the rest of the world when it comes to megafauna. So they tend to be connected. I mean, I don't think I've ever written an article about urban tourism just because it's not where I like to spend my time. Sorry for everyone who likes living in cities, but it's just I prefer the countryside or nature.
And do you ever connect, like, or how do you connect this to research? Or, like,
No, I haven't actually worked with what I studied other than as a journalist and as a photographer since I finished my research, basically. It just this. So I decided I was gonna take a year and drive around Southern Africa anyway before I continued to do a PhD. But by the time I had done that, it seemed like I could have a viable career doing this, and I just thought it was much more fun.
I was just going to ask you quickly. So I'm super shocked by all the stuff going on in Sweden, and that like feels really close to home being here. And I'm kind of pinning all the hopes of you protecting the whole wilderness yourself. So like, what are you going to do there? Like, how are you going to kind of, like, what are the steps when you're there? And I don't know, like, I just love to know a bit more about like what's going to happen. Like, are you going to just go and take pictures and document things and like spread the word? Like, I don't know. Yeah,
so we've been working on this for a couple of years now. So I started documenting the clear cuts during the pandemic. When it was, other assignments disappeared very quickly, but it was easy to, at that time I lived in Sweden, I had a car here, so I could go up and start doing this. But I mean, there is a lot happening, and there are many people involved. Now there aren't many people, the reason I got involved was because there were no professional photographers focusing on this. Like everyone else was, and to a large extent still is, focused on photographing the beautiful forests, which is nice, but it just reinforces the picture that the industry is telling us that everything's fine and we're the most sustainable forestry industry in the world, which I don't quite agree with, and most researchers don't agree with it. But if that's what you keep getting told all the time, then you do end up believing it. So, I mean, there's an amazing journalist here in Sweden. So again, if you speak Swedish, that's great. If you don't, it doesn't help. But she started out when I was up north documenting. She came up, and I think I was interviewed for the first article, and it was meant to be one article. And I think since then she's written like 50 articles and a book that was released a few weeks ago, exposing. Well, I mean, I'm not an investigative journalist, so this stuff with the scandals, that's not coming from me. Like I document and I try to get the photos out. So, I mean, one of the things that we've seen that's changed has been at the beginning of this, none of the big, other than the specific like forest NGOs, none of the big Swedish NGOs or the big NGOs active in Sweden were focusing at all on Sweden for deforestation. It was all about the Amazon and Borneo. Like none of them were interested in talking about what was happening here, because you need to be careful about certain relationships and all the rest of it. Since then, they've pretty much all bought like large collections of images of clear cuts so that they can use them for their campaigns about the Swedish forest. And that's a really great step, because we're all in our echo chambers, right? So it's great, like have a decent sized Instagram following and yay, but those are all people who follow me because they care about these issues or they like pretty pictures. Those aren't the people that need to be reached. So something like Naturskyddsföreningen, which is our biggest one, they are, I'm collaborating with them for the work I'm doing now. They reach hundreds of thousands of people, and so you need that, and you need the mainstream media, and then eventually you need the politicians to care, but they won't care unless they get voted out, or they're afraid of getting voted out, and that's one of the reasons that we the next focus now for us needs to be more international media, and it's because it's one of the few things that they are afraid of, because if it gets out internationally, we had something like this in the 90s, where all of a sudden some of the large German printing companies just boycotted Swedish wood and Swedish paper because of all the publicity that it was receiving, and they didn't want to be associated with it. But then, that led to like a new wave of greenwashing, that it was great for 2 years, and then it turned out that it was just back to normal again. And we don't have that time now. Spruce trees and pines, they can live over 500 years, and then a forest, like the ecosystem, can be many, many thousands of years old. And yet outside of our national parks, most of which are in the mountains anyway, only 12% of the forests are more than 120 years old. And those are the ones that are being logged now, because that's the only ones that have large enough trees to make it worthwhile. So all these, of this 70%, let's say that 50% is just plantations of that 70, so like 80% of what we have, has been planted in the last 100 years. But that's largely too young to clear cut, right? So the 1% that they're clear cutting every year, and 1% is a lot. It's like 0.95. The Amazon, Brazil clear cuts like 0.6, I think. Right? So we're winning this race. But that's not there. Like, they're taking that from that last 12%. And some of the stuff that's happening, you just wouldn't believe it. Like, there was a new national park that was going to be declared, or that was declared, but it was like, in a year, this is going to be a national park. So the state-owned forest company went in and cleared cut in the middle of that area because it's not protected yet. So there's a lot of that going on, and the only thing we can, there's many things to do, but the main thing is just to make more people aware of what's happening, because most people are not okay with this. But if they don't know the scale that it's happening at, and they look outside and say, yeah, but this tree's here. Stockholm is actually great, because it's a city of affluent people, and so no forestry company would consider coming and clear cutting on Djurgården, right? Because it would be an uproar. But if you do it somewhere where there's like 50 people living, and the landowners actually live in the city 2 hours away, and you can't really see it, and it's cash in hand for whoever owns that forest, and a lot of people are being told that this is the only way that you can make this profitable, which is not true. We're not opposed to forestry, we're just opposed to this type of forestry. There are many other ways of doing it, and this would be illegal in most of Europe. You would risk prison sentences in a lot of Eastern Europe for this, but here it's like, yeah. There's a joke in the industry. We have a lot of guys who come from this industry but have left, or after retirement, they've become kind of activists, I guess you could say. And they joke that there's 2 laws in Sweden that you can safely ignore. One is jaywalking, and the other one is anything to do with forestry. It's great.
What's the one thing that you want us to do or consider when we leave this room today? If you can make an impact on all of us.
The main impact is that you now know.
Yeah.
And
what do we do about it?
The best thing to do really is to contact any of these organizations, because they all, so one of the things that they often need help with, for example, so what the process in Sweden, right, is if you want to clear cut a forest, you have to report it to the government, right? But you only have to do that 6 weeks before you do the clear cutting. And the government agency, which is supposed to then go and investigate and make sure that there's nothing here that should be protected, they get to less than 10% of the forests that have been reported that they're not going to be clear cut. And of course, the companies all know this, so they never report more than 6 weeks before they're going to clear cut, right? And there was actually a motion to shorten it to 3 weeks, which I don't think went through. But so what a lot of these groups do, from Skydda Skogen, for example, is they will go out and they will do surveys basically in forests as soon as they hear that, okay, because there's a website, Sweden is good for public information, right? So there are websites where these reports come in and they can see, okay, this forest is going to be clear cut. We think from the satellite photos that this is actually like a forest of high biodiversity value. And so they will send out volunteers to go and look for red listed species, because that is the only way to get a forest protected. It's not a guarantee. A lot of forests get cut down anyway, but if you can find endangered orchids or mushrooms or lichen, then that's the one way to get them protected. And you don't need to be an expert. A lot of the people who do that now, they have no training. They just joined other teams. They were told, like, okay, here's 5 things that you should look for. Here are photos. Go, and you go out 6 or 7 people together. So that's one thing. And I mean, the other thing is, but again, we have our echo chambers, right? But the more we can share what's happening, the better. Think about it when you vote, if you can vote. But at the end of the day, I mean, as a photographer, my interest in this is just, it needs to be commonplace that people need to see this, and it's useful to see it for yourself. I mean, so one of the really nice things that happened as a result of this was the people you meet who are engaged in this, and the amount you learn. I mean, now, all the things that I used to think were forests that I now realize are plantations. It's been fantastic to learn about that and to be taken into really nice forests with somebody who knows what they're talking about. It's been really wonderful. And I need it, I think, for my soul, when I go for 2.5 weeks and just document dead forests. And it's nice to, once every few days, to go into a living one as well. And I hope that's still standing a year from now.
I want to say that I find it so touching that you know so much about the subject and that you share so openly. It's really nice to listen to you telling that story.
Thanks. I mean, it's what we need to do. It needs to be made open. And I'm not the biggest expert on this, so that's why I don't go into too much data, because I'm not the right person. And quite frankly, I don't think that's what you're not here to listen to detailed statistics about exactly what's going on. But the big picture is important to get out there.
This might be a controversial question, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. But you mentioned, everyone has the power to vote. Do you have a suggestion for who we should not vote for, or who we should? But you don't have to if you don't.
No, I don't care. I mean, unfortunately, there aren't many parties that take this seriously. I mean, the Greens obviously do. The current government is bad. The one we're likely to get next is going to be worse. I mean, really, the bigger than voting for me would be putting pressure on the politicians from the main parties. And so one of the reasons why it's so important that this gets out more is that most people don't want this, right? And a lot of the justifications are just complete fabrications. Like, forestry used to be a really important industry in Sweden, like 100 years ago. But as part of our GDP today, it's pretty irrelevant. And they're smarter here than in Australia, for example, where, I mean, now they have a new government, but where in the past it's been like, oh, let's just pretend that climate change doesn't exist. No, these guys are much smarter than that. They absolutely acknowledge climate change, and they say, we are the solution. The only way that we can fight climate change is to plant young trees. The old trees are wasteful, right? They're not good. So we need to cut them down and plant new trees instead. And that's what I meant with ignoring science is, in a real forest in the north, like 70-80% of the carbon storage happens underground in the mycelia, the symbiotic relationship between fungi and trees. And that all, of course, disappears if you first kill all the trees and then go over with big machines. And I mean, it's basically agriculture, right? But they ignore that part of the science. I think there was another, I mean, you can see the tracks in the ground. They completely ignore that part. But it is clever, because it would be much easier to refute them if they said that climate change isn't a problem.
Yeah.
But that's not the approach. They say, no, this is the biggest challenge that we're facing today, and we are the answer to this. And so you end up having to argue about data points instead. which is not that interesting for most of the population, right? And then it becomes easy to be like, yeah, but I don't know which side is right with this. So that was the main reason for deciding to do this, because you can, and they do, argue that this is not a clear cut, because look, there are trees. You can see several trees. And so by their definition, and they do make the definitions in Sweden, that's not a clear cut, that's a forest, right? But if you see a picture like this, it doesn't really matter whether somebody says, yeah, but there's 3 trees, that's right. Everyone knows that this is a clear cut when you look at the photograph.
Yeah.
And that was the purpose of going out with a visual campaign, because it makes the details pretty relevant.
I think we had one more question, and that'll be the last question.
Yeah, I have a question. Like there are deforestation and there are wildfires, and as you mentioned, Australia over the past years they had to kill thousands of camels due to wildfire, and then they started disturbing the water reserves and the urban lifestyle. Do you think these actions are justified in order to maintain the ecosystem?
I know I talked a little bit in the beginning about hands-off and hands-off. It is definitely, its own topic for a long talk, because it is so complicated. Even though it's often necessary to be hands-on, the truth is that even today our understanding of how ecosystems work is so poor that even with the best of intentions we make things worse. And then there's always going to be questions. So I wrote a piece recently about more direct hands-on, whether if you see an animal with a broken leg, should you intervene or not, right? Like where do you draw the line between letting nature take its course and empathy? And I don't think that's nearly as clear as a lot of photographers and filmmakers who seem to think that you should never get involved. Another thing is, okay, like in order to protect the ecosystem, we need to kill all these animals that are not actually indigenous to the area, which makes sense from an ecological point of view, but ethically it's a bit more dubious. I'm not going to say that it was either right or wrong to kill the camels. I prefer that we don't do things like that. But on the other hand, it's Australia in particular has such massive challenges ecologically because of us. Obviously, the camels are there because of us. To a large extent, the fact that it's as dry as it is because of us. And sometimes you just end up painting yourself in a corner where there's like none of the things you can do in response are great, and I don't like having to talk about like the lesser evil, but and I don't know the details enough of that I want to say. Just other than that, it is complicated. Trophy hunting as well is another topic you could talk about for a long time. Abhorrent in some ways, and without it we'd have bigger problems in some ways. So.
Thank you so much for this.
Uplifting talk. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.